Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are mapping out what is honestly a fascinating historical puzzle. We're going to analyze the historical evolution of solar symbolism within early Christian rituals and architecture. It's basically a deep dive into how ancient sun worship symbols allegedly migrated directly into early Christian practices, based entirely on our source material. Let's get started, shall we?
So, the source begins with a striking passage from the Old Testament book of Ezekiel. It lays out a very explicit, ancient prohibition against facing east to worship the sun. This was a practice heavily linked to mystery religions back then, like those of Tammuz and Mithra. And this scripture acts as a sort of baseline for us, showing just how massive the later theological shifts would actually turn out to be.
To explore this historical mystery objectively, we'll break it down into 5 key themes. We'll look at sun gods and early Christianity, church architecture and facing east, church symbols and rituals, the calendar, specifically Sunday and Christmas, and finally, the merging of ancient traditions.
Let's jump right into our first theme, sun gods and early Christianity, and the shift in titles and art. Now, the source points out a massive linguistic shift here. The New Testament originally describes Jesus using the metaphor of a guiding light, much like other prophets, right? But fast forward to the 4th century, and the language dramatically changes. Suddenly, theological texts start describing Jesus with literal solar titles, like the Son of Righteousness and the Son of Justice.
And, this shift in terminology didn't just happen out of nowhere. It was heavily championed by some foundational 4th century figures, absolute heavy hitters, like St. John Chrysostom, St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, and Ephraim the Syrian. According to the analysis, they began directly linking Jesus to the sun in their writings, cementing a shift that our source argues was really solidified right after the Council of Nicaea.
This translates visually too. Researchers suggest that despite early, very strict prohibitions against sun statues, remember King Asa and King Josiah were actively destroying solar altars, solar imagery still became a total cornerstone of Christian art. The glowing halo, or nimbus, emerged prominently. The source specifically highlights the Irish chapel of St. Columbanus over in the Vatican, where saints are depicted raising their hands in reverence to a literal solar disk.
Moving right along to our second area, church architecture and facing east, looking at the actual direction of devotion.
Take a look at the physical alignment here. Ancient mystery religion temples dedicated to Tammuz or Mithra were built facing east, with their key rituals perfectly timed for sunrise. Strikingly, the source points out that traditional Christian churches also align their structures to the east, with early morning mass specifically held at sunrise. The source argues this is a direct structural continuation of ancient solar reverence.
To back this up, the historical analysis points to a highly specific Greek phrase, Anatolis palpsudi, which is still used in traditional rituals today. It literally translates to, raise your eyes to the sunrise. So the source argues this anchors the physical act of modern worship directly to the ancient practice of greeting the rising sun. It is pretty wild to think about that connection still existing today. Now, just to ensure we're looking at this impartially, this explainer also highlights the church's official stance. They state that facing east is based on the belief that Jesus will return from the east during the second coming. However, the source rebuts this. They argue it stems from taking a Gospel of Matthew metaphor completely literally. According to the source, the scripture was just comparing the undeniable obviousness of his return to lightning flashing from east to west, not necessarily giving a literal geographical coordinate for architects to follow.
The historical timeline really makes the source's point even clearer here. Early followers didn't actually build temples at all. They just gathered in homes for ecclesia. It wasn't until immediately after the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which is when the source claims Jesus was synthesized with solar deities, that the very first physical church was constructed in Jerusalem. And sure enough, it was built with this brand new eastward alignment.
That brings us to Section 3, Church Symbols and Rituals, finding the sun in the details.
So this alleged influence goes way beyond just the big buildings. The source groups 3 specific, everyday physical practices as direct holdovers from ancient solar worship. First, the term shamas, used for a deacon, which allegedly shares etymological roots with servants of the Sun Temple. Then, the distinct monk's haircut. And finally, the perfectly round shape of the Catholic Eucharist wafer.
Ever wonder about the tonsure? According to the analysis, this perfectly round shaved patch on the top of a monk or cleric's head wasn't just a quirky hairstyle. The source claims it was a physical recreation of the solar disk. Basically, they were carving a literal halo or nimbus right onto the practitioner's head as a mark of solar devotion. And the source certainly doesn't make this claim lightly.
This argument is bolstered by some major historical anthropologists. Scholars like Max Muller, James Fraser in his famous work The Golden Bough, and Robert Graves in The White Goddess. They all categorized the tensure as a definitive remnant of ancient solar worship that was seamlessly absorbed by the early church. Okay, on to Section 4, the calendar, focusing on Sunday and Christmas. The calendar reveals another massive shift. In the Old Testament, the Sabbath, the day of rest, is strictly established on Saturday. Early Christians continued observing this Saturday Sabbath, but by the 4th century, through councils like Nicaea and Laodicea, Rome officially shifted the holy day of rest. And where did they move it? Right to the traditional Roman day of the sun, Sunday.
And then we have the whole debate over Christmas. The source explains the historical split in Christmas dates is basically a matter of absorption. Down in late December, the Roman Empire celebrated Saturnalia and the birth of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. So the Roman Catholic Church aligned Christmas with this date. Meanwhile, in the East, January 6 was already celebrated as the birthday of the sun god Aion. Because of this, Eastern and Armenian churches aligned their Christmas with January 6th.
Just to give this some real historical weight, the source brings in a quote from a 4th century Christian writer, Father Epiphanius. He documented that in Alexandria, pagan worshippers were already celebrating the birth of the sun god Aion on the exact same date that would later become the Eastern Christian Christmas.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, merging ancient traditions and cultures. Ultimately, the historical analysis frames this entire evolution not as some series of theological accidents, but as a deliberate, highly pragmatic political strategy by the Roman Empire. The source calls this the Sol Invictus strategy. Rome was vast, it was fractured, and it was filled with devoted pagan sun worshippers alongside a rapidly growing Christian population. By visually and ritually merging Jesus with the unconquered sun, Rome could achieve some much-needed national unity under one synthesized banner. When we step back and look at the adoption of titles like Son of Righteousness, the strict eastward orientation of traditional churches, micro-rituals featuring solar discs, and of course shifting the calendar to Sunday, the source presents a really comprehensive case. It paints a vivid picture of a profound cultural and religious merging that shaped the very foundations of modern faith.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating perspective. If the very buildings, daily rituals, and calendars we interact with today were heavily shaped by ancient sun worshippers seeking unity in a fractured empire, well, what other historical secrets are hiding in plain sight, just woven into the fabric of our everyday lives? It is definitely something to think about the next time you check your calendar or watch the sunrise. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.